The rain tapped gently against the window pane as I sat in the armchair, a cup of tea warming my hands. Farid was in the study, lost in his crossword puzzles, while I gazed out at the garden. The hydrangeas were in full bloom, their vibrant blues and purples a testament to the hours I'd spent nurturing them. It was a quiet life, predictable and peaceful, and most days I was content. But today, something felt different. Like the air was charged with an energy I couldn't quite place. "Amina," Farid called from the other room, pulling me from my thoughts. "We're invited to dinner. Tariq's. His wife's cooking is supposed to be exceptional." I hesitated, my fingers tracing the rim of the teacup. Dinner parties weren't really my thing. I preferred the comfort of home, the familiarity of our routines. But Farid's voice had that tone, the one that meant he'd already decided we were going. "All right," I said, setting the cup down. "What time?" At 7, we pulled up to a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. The rain had subsided, leaving the streets glistening under the soft glow of streetlights. The door opened before we could knock, and there he was. Tariq. He was taller than I'd imagined, with a warm smile that reached his eyes. His handshake was firm, his greeting effusive. "Amina," Farid, "welcome. Please, come in." The house was cozy, filled with the aroma of spices and the low hum of conversation. Layla, his wife, greeted us with a polite nod before disappearing into the kitchen. Tariq led us to the living room, where a fire crackled in the hearth. He was different from what I'd expected. Charismatic, yes, but there was something else. A vulnerability that peeked through his confident demeanor. As the evening unfolded, the conversation flowed effortlessly. Farid and Tariq talked shop, while I listened, occasionally chiming in with a thought or question. But it was during dessert, as Layla excused herself to answer a phone call, that the dynamic shifted. "Do you ever feel stuck?" Tariq asked suddenly, his voice low. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, it was like the rest of the room faded away. "Stuck?" I echoed, my heart skipping a beat. He nodded, leaning forward slightly. "Like you're living a life that's perfectly fine, but something's missing. Something you can't quite put your finger on." I swallowed, the words hitting a little too close to home. I think everyone feels that way sometimes." He studied me for a moment, his gaze intense. "Do you?" I looked down at my hands, suddenly aware of how dry my throat felt. "Maybe. Sometimes." The air between us grew heavy, charged with something unspoken. I could feel Farid beside me, oblivious, as Tariq's eyes lingered on mine. "This is dangerous," a voice in my head whispered. But another part of me, a part one hadn't acknowledged in years, felt alive in a way I couldn't ignore. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Layla returned, the conversation shifted, and before I knew it, we were saying our goodbyes. Tariq's hand brushed mine as he handed me my coat, and I felt a jolt of electricity race through me. "It was lovely meeting you, Amina," he said softly, his voice a whisper that only I could hear. "You too," I managed to reply, my voice barely above a murmur. The drive home was quiet. Farid hummed along to the radio, while I stared out the window, my mind racing. That look in Tariq's eyes, the weight of his words, it stirred something in me I thought I'd buried long ago. Was this what I'd been missing? A connection, a spark, something that made me feel alive? When we got home, I slipped into the garden, the cool night air a balm to my restless thoughts. The hydrangeas glowed in the moonlight, their beauty suddenly more poignant. I knelt by the bed, my fingers brushing the delicate petals. "What are you doing, Amina?" The voice in my head demanded. "You have a good life, a good husband. Why are you letting this fantasy take hold?" But deep down, I knew why. Because for the first time in years, I felt seen. And that was a feeling I wasn't ready to let go of. The days that followed the dinner at Tariq's house were restless. I tried to slip back into the rhythm of my life, watering the garden, folding laundry, flipping through the pages of my historical novels, but my mind kept drifting. His words clung to me like the scent of rain-soaked soil, persistent and impossible to ignore. What had he meant by feeling stuck? And why, of all people, had he shared that with me? Farid noticed my distraction. Over breakfast one morning, he glanced up from his newspaper, his brow furrowed. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice gentle but probing. "Everything all right?" I forced a smile and reached for the teapot. "Just tired, I think." The rain always makes me feel a little sluggish. The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. How could I explain something I didn't even understand myself? The truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about Tarek. His laugh, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way he looked at me as we stood in his kitchen, it was all-consuming. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment of connection between two people who happened to cross paths. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. And that terrified me. A week after the dinner, I found myself standing in the produce aisle of the grocery store, staring at a display of ripe avocados. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the hum of chatter and shopping carts filled the air. I was lost in thought, my fingers idly tracing the smooth skin of an avocado, when I heard his voice. "Amina?" I froze. Turning slowly, I saw Tarek standing a few feet away, a basket slung over one arm. His smile was warm but hesitant, as if he wasn't sure how I'd react to seeing him again. "Tarek," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was racing. What a surprise. He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "I was just picking up a few things for dinner. Layla's been craving falafel." He chuckled, but there was a note of something loneliness in his tone. I nodded, unsure of what to say. The air between us felt charged, and I was acutely aware of the inches that separated us. "How is Layla?" I asked, more out of politeness than genuine curiosity. He shrugged, his gaze dropping to the floor. "She's busy. Always busy. It's like we're ships passing in the night most days." He looked up, and for a moment, his mask slipped. "I miss her," he admitted, his voice soft. My breath caught. What was I supposed to say to that? I wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but I held back, afraid of crossing a line I wasn't sure I even wanted to see. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's hard when things feel disconnected." He nodded, his eyes locking with mine. "Yes, it is." He hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking about our conversation the other night. It's been on my mind." My cheeks flushed, and I looked away, pretending to inspect the avocados again. "It was a nice evening," I said carefully. "It was," he agreed. There was a pause, and then he took a step closer. "Amina, I feel like I can talk to you. Like you understand me in a way no one else does." My heart pounded in my chest, and I glanced around, as if someone might be watching us. But the store was as oblivious as ever, its fluorescent lights humming on. "Tarek," I began, my voice trembling. I feel the same way, but this is complicated." He nodded, his expression serious. "I know, and I'm not asking for anything. I needed you to know that." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. What was happening here? This was uncharted territory, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. But at the same time, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him, the way his presence seemed to fill a void I hadn't even realized was there. We stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. Finally, he took a step back, his smile returning, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I should let you finish your shopping," he said, his tone light again. "It was good to see you, Amina." "You too," I replied, my voice barely audible. He turned and walked away, and I watched him go, my hands gripping the handle of my cart so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, longing, fear, excitement. What was I doing? I finished my shopping in a daze, tossing items into my cart without really seeing them. When I got home, I unpacked the groceries mechanically, my thoughts still consumed by Tarek. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something, a precipice I wasn't sure I was ready to jump off. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the pull drawing me closer. That evening, I found myself in the garden again, the cool night air a welcome respite from the chaos in my mind. The hydrangeas were still blooming, their delicate petals glowing in the moonlight. I knelt beside them, my fingers brushing against the soft leaves. What am I doing? I asked myself, the question echoing in my head. Why can't I stop thinking about him? But I already knew the answer. Because, for the first time in years, I felt alive. And that feeling was intoxicating. The next day, I found myself standing outside Tarek's office building. I'd told myself it was just a walk, that I wasn't really going to see him. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I needed to see him, to talk to him, to figure out what this feeling was. I hesitated at the entrance, my heart pounding in my chest. What if he's busy? What if he doesn't want to see me? But before I could talk myself out of it, the doors swung open and there he was. Amina, he said, his eyes widening in surprise. What are you doing here? I took a deep breath, my hands trembling at my sides. I needed to see you. Tarek's expression softened, and for a moment we just stood there, the city bustling around us. I could feel the weight of his gaze, searching, questioning, but also something else. Something that made my chest tighten. Come in, he finally said, stepping aside to let me pass. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of something beneath it, anticipation, maybe? I wasn't sure. All I knew was that I couldn't turn back now. I followed him inside, the cool air of the building a stark contrast to the warmth of the sun outside. His office was on the 5th floor, and the elevator ride felt endless. The silence between us was heavy, charged with unspoken words. I kept my eyes on the numbers above the door, watching them slowly climb. 1, 2, 3. Each floor felt like an eternity. When we finally reached his office, he gestured for me to sit. It was a small, cozy space, filled with books and papers, a little cluttered but warm. He took the seat across from me, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped together. You said you needed to see me, he began, his voice low, measured. What's on your mind? I hesitated, my fingers fidgeting in my lap. How could I explain something I didn't fully understand myself? The words felt like they were stuck in my throat, tangled up with all the emotions I'd been trying to ignore. I've been thinking about what you said. I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper, about feeling stuck, about how sometimes, even when you have everything, it's not enough. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. And I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. I feel that way too, I admitted. Not all the time, but sometimes. With Farid, with everything. I didn't even realize it until you said it. Tarek's expression shifted, something dark and uncertain flashing across his face. He looked away for a moment, his jaw tightening. When he looked back at me, there was a vulnerability in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. It's hard, isn't it? He said softly. To feel like you're just going through the motions. Like you're missing something, but you don't know what. Yes, that was it exactly. That was the feeling I'd been struggling to put into words. I nodded, my throat tight. We fell into silence again, but it wasn't uncomfortable this time. It felt like we were both acknowledging something unspoken, something that had been lingering between us since that first dinner at his house. I could feel it, like a thread pulling us closer together, and I didn't know whether to resist or give in. Amina, he said after a long moment, his voice quiet but intense. I need to tell you something. My breath caught. What now? What could possibly come next? I felt a mix of anticipation and fear, like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't see the bottom of. I've been thinking about you, he continued, his words measured, but filled with emotion. A lot. More than I should. And I know it's wrong, I know it's not, we shouldn't, but I can't help it. I stared at him, my heart racing. His words were like a spark, igniting something inside me that I hadn't even realized was there. I wanted to respond, to say something, but I couldn't find the words. He leaned forward, his eyes searching mine. I don't know what this is, he admitted, but I know it's something. And I think you feel it too. I did. I felt it in the way my pulse quickened when he looked at me, in the way my thoughts kept drifting back to him, no matter how hard I tried to focus on anything else. I felt it in the way his words resonated with something deep inside me, something I hadn't dared to acknowledge until now. But I couldn't say that. I couldn't admit it, not out loud. So I just sat there, my hands clenched in my lap, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. I'm not asking for anything, he said, his voice soft but urgent. I just needed you to know, because I think you needed to hear it. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Why are you telling me this? I asked, my voice barely audible. He leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. Because I can't keep pretending it's not there, he said simply. And I don't think you can either. I looked away, my eyes stinging. He was right. I'd been trying to ignore it, to push it aside, but it was there, a constant presence in the back of my mind. And now, here it was, laid bare between us. What do we do? I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. When I finally looked back at him, I saw the conflict in his eyes, the same struggle I felt inside. He wanted to say something, but he didn't know what. None of this was simple. None of it was easy. I don't know, he admitted finally, his voice heavy with regret. But I do know one thing. I can't just walk away from this. From you. His words hung in the air between us, a declaration and a question all at once. I felt the weight of them, the responsibility of them. And I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I couldn't walk away either. But what did that mean? What could we do, caught in this impossible situation? I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone. Tariq, I started, but he held up a hand, stopping me. Don't, he said softly. Not yet. Let's just sit with this for a moment. Let's just be here. I nodded, my heart aching. And so we sat there, in the quiet of his office, the unspoken words and the tangled emotions between us, neither of us knowing what to do next. The silence stretched on, heavy and loaded, until finally, he broke it. What now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. I don't know. The question hung in the air, dense and suffocating. What now? Neither of us had an answer, and yet the weight of it pressed down on me as if it were the only thing that mattered. Tariq's office felt smaller now, the walls closing in, the faint hum of the city outside a distant reminder of a world that didn't know what we were feeling. I looked at him, really looked at him. His tall frame seemed tense, his hands resting on the edge of his desk like they were holding him up. His warm eyes, usually so steady, were searching mine for something, guidance, reassurance, maybe both. I didn't have either to give. I don't know, I repeated softly, my voice barely audible. Maybe we should just let it be. Pretend it didn't happen. His jaw tightened, and he shook his head. Amina, we can't just pretend. Not after this. His words were firm, but there was a vulnerability in them that made my chest ache. I wanted to argue, to tell him that we had to, that it was the only way to protect what we both had. But the truth was, I didn't believe it. Not really. Then what? I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. What do we do? Tariq? Because I don't see a way forward that doesn't hurt someone. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I don't know either, but I can't just walk away from this. From you. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach, leaving me breathless. I didn't know what to say, how to respond. The air between us felt charged, electric, and I could feel the pull of it, drawing me closer to him even as my mind screamed at me to step back. We're both married, I whispered, my voice trembling. We have lives, responsibilities, people who depend on us. I know, he said, his voice low and pained. But what about us? What about what we need? I shook my head, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. I don't know, Tariq. I don't know what to do. He stepped closer then, his presence overwhelming. I could feel the warmth of him, the scent of his cologne filling my senses. My heart raced, my body betraying the turmoil in my mind. Maybe we don't have to figure it out right now, he said softly, his eyes searching mine. Maybe we just take it one step at a time. I looked up at him, my breath catching in my throat. And what does that look like? He hesitated, his hand hovering just above my arm before he pulled it back, as if afraid to touch me. I don't know, but I can't just let you walk out of here without knowing that we mean something. I swallowed hard, my mind spinning. It does, I admit it, the words coming out in a rush. It means something, but that doesn't make it any easier. He nodded, his expression softening. I know, but maybe we don't have to make it harder than it already is. Maybe we just take it one day at a time. I closed my eyes, his words echoing in my mind. One day at a time. It sounded simple, but I knew it wasn't. Every day would be a battle, a struggle to resist the pull between us. But at the same time, the thought of walking away felt impossible. Okay, I said finally, opening my eyes to meet his. One day at a time. He smiled faintly, and for a moment, the weight in the room lifted. But it was short-lived, replaced by the heavy reality of what we were doing. We were standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that could change everything. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to step back. The sound of his phone buzzing on the desk broke the silence, and he glanced at it, his expression tightening. "It's Layla," he said, his voice flat. "She's asking where I am." I felt a pang of guilt, sharp and unrelenting. "You should go," I said quickly, taking a step back. "She's waiting for you." He hesitated, his eyes still on mine. "And what about you?" I forced a smile, though it felt hollow. "I'll be fine. I need to figure out how to go home and face Farid without falling apart." He nodded, but he didn't look convinced. "If you need to talk, call me. Anytime." I nodded, though I knew I wouldn't. It was too risky, too tempting. "Take care of yourself, Tariq." He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine before he pulled it back, as if realizing what he was doing. "You too, Amina." I turned and walked out of his office, my legs trembling beneath me. The hallway felt endless, the sound of my footsteps echoing in my ears. By the time I reached my car, the tears were streaming down my face, and I didn't bother to wipe them away. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with thoughts of Tariq, of Farid, of the life I'd built and the one I was risking. I felt lost, adrift in a sea of emotions I didn't know how to navigate. When I pulled into the driveway, the lights were on, and I could see Farid through the window, reading in his favorite chair. My heart clenched at the sight of him, and for a moment, I wanted to turn around, to drive away and never come back. But I couldn't. This was my life, my home. I got out of the car and walked to the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. When I finally stepped inside, Farid looked up, his face breaking into a warm smile. "There you are," he said, his voice soft. I was starting to wonder. I forced a smile, though it felt like a mask. "Sorry, I got caught up." He nodded, setting his book aside. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. "Yeah," I said finally. "Everything's fine." He smiled again, but I could see the concern in his eyes. "You look tired. Why don't you sit down? I'll make you some tea." I nodded, sinking into the couch as he disappeared into the kitchen. The familiar sounds of him moving around, the clinking of the tea kettle, the hum of the stove, should have been comforting. But instead, they felt like a reminder of everything I stood to lose. When he came back, holding a steaming cup of tea, I took it gratefully, my hands still trembling. "Thank you," I said softly. He sat down beside me, his hand resting on my knee. "You've been quiet lately. Is something on your mind?" I looked at him, his kind face, his gentle eyes, and felt a surge of guilt so strong it nearly knocked me over. "No," I lied, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "Just tired." He nodded, though I could tell he didn't believe me. But he didn't push, and for that, I was grateful. He leaned back in his chair, picking up his book again, and I sipped my tea, the silence between us heavy with the things I couldn't say. And as I sat there, I couldn't help but wonder how long I could keep pretending that everything was okay. How long before the cracks in my facade became too wide to ignore. The thought terrified me, but not as much as the thought of losing Tariq. Farid's voice broke through my thoughts. "You're quiet tonight. What's on your mind?" I looked at him, his kind eyes searching mine, and for a moment I wondered if I should tell him. If I should just let it all out, the mess of emotions, the guilt, the longing. But I couldn't. Not yet. "Nothing," I said softly. "Just thinking." He nodded, though I could see the concern in his eyes. "If you ever want to talk, you know I'm here, right?" I nodded, the lump in my throat making it hard to speak. "I know." He smiled faintly, setting his book aside. "You've been distant lately. I want to make sure you're okay." I felt a pang of guilt, sharp and unrelenting. "I'm fine," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "Just tired." He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, leaning back in his chair. "All right, but don't forget, I'm here if you need me." I nodded again, the tears welling up in my eyes. "I know." And as I sat there, sipping my tea, I couldn't help but wonder if he'd still be here if he knew the truth. If he knew how close I was to losing myself. The thought left me feeling more lost than ever,